Welcome to the Lord of the Dark. The systematic extermination of the Nephilim, an ancient Xenos species that had achieved peaceful coexistence with human colonies during the Age of Strife. When the Great Crusade reached their worlds, the Imperium discovered these beings had integrated so thoroughly with humanity that entire populations refused to abandon their Xenos allies.
It is not enough to kill the alien. We must strike its name from the records, its monuments from the soil, and its memory from the minds of men.
The Emperor ordered complete erasure of both the Nephilim and all records of their existence, executing not only the aliens but also the humans who defended them, then purging all historical documentation to ensure no memory of this cooperative relationship would survive to challenge imperial xenophobic doctrine. The Great Crusade was pushing ever outward, fleet after fleet carving paths through the galaxy that humanity had once called home. By this point in the campaign, the Imperium had already encountered countless horrors lurking in the void. Orc empires that stretched across entire sectors, the remnants of enslaving species that had tormented human populations for millennia, and things far worse that defied easy categorization. Every expedition fleet carried with it the same fundamental assumption, born from 10,000 years of nightmare during Old Night. The Xenos were the enemy. They had always been the enemy. Whatever forms they took, whatever honeyed words they might speak, the alien existed only to threaten, corrupt, or consume humanity. So, when the 43rd Expeditionary Fleet translated into real space at the edge of an unremarkable system in the galactic east, the commanders aboard expected to find one of two things: either human worlds ground down by alien oppression, waiting for liberation, or human worlds already dead, picked clean by whatever predatory species had claimed that corner of space. What they found instead was something that simply did not fit into any category the Great Crusade had prepared them for. The fleet's navigator had guided them toward a cluster of stable systems that pre-strife records suggested had once hosted significant human populations. These were the kinds of targets the Crusade prioritized, worlds where the descendants of old Earth might still survive, waiting to be reunited with their species under the Emperor's banner. Initial auger sweeps detected exactly what Expedition Command hoped to see: multiple inhabited worlds, clear signs of technological civilization, and energy signatures consistent with human-derived power generation. The fleet moved inward with practiced efficiency, already preparing the standard protocols for compliance. It was the astropaths who first sensed something unusual. The psychic emanations from these worlds carried a strange quality, a harmonic resonance that felt simultaneously alien and somehow welcoming. Several astropaths reported experiencing sensations of profound peace when they extended their awareness toward the inhabited planets, a stark contrast to the usual static of fear and desperation that characterized most human worlds still recovering from the Age of Strife. Fleet Command noted these observations but initially dismissed them as curiosities. Astropaths were notoriously unreliable when it came to interpreting emotional impressions across interstellar distances. The first visual confirmation came when long-range pictures focused on the third planet of the primary system. The world showed all the hallmarks of successful human colonization. Cities spread across temperate continents, agricultural patterns suggested organized food production, and orbital installations indicated a functioning, space-capable society. But something else was there too. Structures that didn't match any known human architectural tradition, sweeping organic curves that seemed to grow from the landscape rather than being constructed upon it. Alongside distinctly human settlements, these alien constructions existed in what appeared to be deliberate proximity, not as conquered territory or occupied zones, but as neighbors. Fleet Admiral Corvinus ordered the advance elements to hold position while reconnaissance craft moved closer. The images they returned created genuine confusion among the command staff. The alien structures belonged to a species the Imperium had never catalogued, tall, elegant beings that the fleet's iterators would later designate as the Nephilim, based on ancient Terran religious texts describing giants who walked among men. These creatures moved through spaces clearly designed for human habitation, and humans moved through theirs. There were no walls between their settlements, no fortifications, no visible weapons emplacements or defensive perimeters separating the two populations. The reconnaissance teams reported seeing something that many officers initially refused to believe: humans and Nephilim walking together through shared public spaces, mixed gatherings in what appeared to be markets or social venues. Children, human children, playing in areas adjacent to Nephilim young. The two species existed not in the wary cohabitation of conquered and conqueror, but in what could only be described as genuine integration. Admiral Corvinus had served the Great Crusade for decades. He had seen human populations broken by alien tyranny, had witnessed the grateful tears of those liberated from Xenos oppression. He had also seen humans so thoroughly subjugated that they defended their alien masters out of conditioned terror. But this was different. These humans showed no signs of trauma, no evidence of the psychological scarring that always accompanied prolonged Xenos domination. They moved among the Nephilim with the easy familiarity of people interacting with longtime neighbors. The fleet's senior iterator, a woman named Castella who had helped bring dozens of worlds into compliance, requested permission to review all available data before any contact was made. Something about this situation, she argued, required careful consideration. The standard compliance protocols assumed either willing reunification with Terra or resistance that needed to be overcome. They had no framework for a human population that had apparently chosen, freely and without coercion, to build a shared civilization with an alien species. The assessment teams that descended upon the first Nephilim world carried with them standardized protocols developed across hundreds of compliance actions. They had forms for cataloging Xenos threat levels, procedures for evaluating human populations corrupted by alien influence, and clear guidelines for determining the extent of purification required before a world could be brought into Imperial compliance. What they found rendered every single one of these protocols essentially meaningless because nothing in their training had prepared them for what the Nephilim represented. The initial reports that filtered back to the expedition commanders painted a picture that many simply refused to accept as accurate. Survey teams documented human settlements where Nephilim moved freely among the population, not as masters or overlords, but as neighbors, colleagues, and in some documented cases, as members of mixed family units that had persisted across multiple generations. The integration was not superficial or recent. Archaeological assessments indicated that this cooperative relationship had existed for at least 3,000 years, possibly longer, stretching back to the earliest days of the Age of Strife, when these worlds had been cut off from the rest of humanity. The Nephilim themselves presented a fascinating study in Xenos biology that the Mechanicum adepts found deeply troubling precisely because it was so unremarkable. They were humanoid in basic structure, standing slightly shorter than baseline humans on average, with elongated limbs and faces that featured large, dark eyes, adapted for low-light conditions. Their skin displayed subtle bioluminescent properties that shifted in response to emotional states, a form of communication that human populations had apparently learned to read as naturally as facial expressions. They were neither physically imposing nor possessed of any obvious biological weapons. In a galaxy filled with predatory species designed by evolution or malice to kill, the Nephilim seemed almost deliberately inoffensive. What made the assessment teams truly uncomfortable was the complete absence of any hierarchy favoring either species. The expedition had encountered human populations living under Xenos rule before, broken people who had been subjugated and degraded until they served their alien masters without question. They had also found humans who had turned the tables, enslaving Xenos populations and using them as labor or worse. Both situations fit neatly into Imperial understanding of how species interacted. But the Nephilim worlds operated on principles that defied this binary framework entirely. The economic systems showed genuine partnership rather than exploitation. Nephilim agricultural techniques, which utilized their natural sensitivity to electromagnetic fields to optimize growing conditions, had been freely shared with human farmers. Human industrial capabilities, particularly in metallurgy and heavy manufacturing, had been integrated into Nephilim communities that had historically lacked such development. Trade between settlements was conducted on terms that benefited both parties, with no evidence of the systematic resource extraction that typically characterized Xenos-human relationships. The assessment teams documented markets where both species haggled, worked, and socialized with an ease that spoke of centuries of normalized coexistence. Cultural integration proved even more difficult to categorize. The Nephilim possessed their own religious traditions, complex philosophical frameworks that centered on concepts of harmonic existence and the interconnection of all conscious beings. Rather than suppressing human spirituality or having their own beliefs crushed, the two species had developed syncretic traditions that blended elements of both. Temples stood in major population centers where humans and Nephilim worshipped together, their ceremonies incorporating practices from both cultures in ways that the assessment teams found genuinely unsettling. This was not the desperate compromise of conquered peoples. This was willing, enthusiastic synthesis. Educational institutions presented perhaps the starkest challenge to imperial assumptions. Children of both species learned together in shared facilities, their curricula designed to provide understanding of both human and Nephilim history, science, and philosophy. Young humans grew up speaking Nephilim harmonic language alongside their native Gothic derivatives, while Nephilim children learned human mathematical notation and technical terminology. The generation currently coming of age had never known any other way of existence. To them, the separation of species was as alien a concept as their integration was to the Imperium. The military assessment created its own category of concerns. These worlds were not defenseless, having survived the age of strife through a combination of isolation and genuine defensive capability. But their military forces were integrated at every level, with human and Nephilim soldiers serving in mixed units under commanders of both species. They had fought together against orc raiders, against human pirates, against the various predatory threats that had emerged during the long night. Their tactical doctrines leveraged the strengths of both species, combining human aggression and physical resilience with Nephilim sensory capabilities and their strange talent for predicting enemy movements. They were not a conquered people defended by alien masters, nor aliens protected by human mercenaries. They were a single fighting force that had bled together for generations. The expedition commanders faced an impossible situation when the assessment reports were compiled. Standard compliance protocols assumed that human populations desired liberation from xenosuppression, that they would welcome the Imperium as saviors delivering them from alien tyranny. But these populations showed no signs of wanting liberation. Initial diplomatic contacts were met with polite confusion rather than desperate gratitude. The humans of these worlds did not see themselves as oppressed. They saw themselves as partners in a civilization that had thrived while the rest of humanity tore itself apart during the age of strife. Some even expressed sympathy for imperial forces, viewing them as traumatized survivors of whatever horrors had befallen the rest of humanity, unable to comprehend that peaceful coexistence was possible. The question that the assessment teams ultimately could not answer was whether these humans were corrupted or simply different. They showed no signs of genetic modification, no evidence of psychic manipulation, no indication of the subtle biological slavery that some Xenos species employed. Medical examinations confirmed they were baseline human in every measurable way. Psychological evaluations found no evidence of conditioning or indoctrination beyond normal cultural education. By every metric the Imperium possessed, these were free humans who had simply chosen to live alongside aliens. And that choice, that willing embrace of Xenos partnership, represented something far more dangerous to Imperial doctrine than any form of slavery ever could. The astropathic messages that began filtering back to Terra carried a tone that made the scribes in the Imperial Palace pause over their transcription work. These were not the triumphant declarations of worlds brought to compliance, nor were they the urgent requests for reinforcement that accompanied difficult campaigns against hostile forces. Instead, they arrived saturated with something far more troubling, a quality of confusion and uncertainty that had no place in the communications of the Great Crusade's unstoppable advance. The first formal reports came from the expedition commanders themselves, men and women who had overseen dozens of successful compliance actions and who understood precisely what was expected of them. Their words were carefully chosen, diplomatically phrased in the manner of officers who knew their communications would be reviewed by multiple levels of imperial authority. But beneath the professional language lurked a problem none of them quite knew how to articulate. The human populations of the Nephilim worlds were not cooperating, not in the way that rebellious planets refused compliance through armed resistance, but in a manner far more unsettling. They simply would not acknowledge that anything was wrong with their current existence. Compliance officers reported holding assemblies in major population centers, delivering the standard proclamations about humanity's reunification under the Emperor's banner, and the glory that awaited those who embraced the imperial truth. The crowds listened politely, asked thoughtful questions about the Imperium's structure and intentions, and then calmly explained that they had no intention of abandoning their Nephilim neighbors. There was no hysteria in their refusals, no fanatical devotion that might be attributed to alien mind control or religious manipulation. They spoke as rational beings making a considered choice, and that rationality made their defiance infinitely more dangerous than any screaming mob could ever be. The reports detailed attempted negotiations that went nowhere, despite both sides remaining entirely civil. Human leaders from the Nephilim worlds expressed genuine interest in establishing relations with the Imperium, even enthusiasm for reconnecting with the broader human species after millennia of isolation. They offered trade agreements, cultural exchanges, scientific cooperation, and every other form of partnership that reasonable civilizations might pursue. What they would not offer was the one thing the Great Crusade demanded without exception: the complete rejection and elimination of their Xenos population. When compliance officers explained that the Nephilim must be destroyed, that this was not a negotiating position, but an absolute requirement for any world joining the Imperium, the human representatives responded with a patience that bordered on patronizing. They understood the Imperium's position. They acknowledged the terrible experiences humanity had suffered at alien hands during the Age of Strife, and they sympathized with the fears that drove such uncompromising policies. Then they politely declined to participate in genocide and asked if perhaps there might be some alternative arrangement. Word spread through the expedition fleets that something unprecedented was occurring. Veterans who had watched populations beg for mercy, who had seen worlds surrender unconditionally rather than face imperial wrath, found themselves confronting communities that simply refused to be afraid. The Nephilim worlds had no great military forces capable of resisting the Imperium's might. Their populations understood perfectly well what the Legiones Astartes could do to their cities if unleashed. They chose defiance anyway, not from ignorance or false hope, but from a moral conviction that apparently outweighed their own survival. The astropaths transmitting these reports back to Terra began including personal observations that technically fell outside their official duties. They described the psychic resonance of these worlds as deeply unsettling precisely because it was so calm. There was no undercurrent of fear or desperation, no building hysteria that might precede mass resistance. The populations had made their choice and accepted whatever consequences would follow. That acceptance, that peaceful certainty, disturbed the astropaths more than any screaming chaos cult ever had. When these communications reached the higher echelons of imperial administration, they created ripples of concern that spread through multiple departments. The Council of Terra received summarized briefings that emphasized the strategic complications of the situation. The Nephilim worlds occupied valuable positions along what would become major trade routes. Their populations possessed technical knowledge preserved from before Old Night that could benefit imperial industry. Simply destroying everything would waste resources that the ever-hungry Crusade desperately needed. But the deeper problem, the one that made senior administrators exchange worried glances across conference tables, was the precedent being established. If these worlds were allowed to maintain their human-Xenos coexistence, even temporarily, word would spread. Other populations would learn that defiance was possible, that the Imperium's absolute demands might be negotiated or delayed. The entire framework of compliance, built on the understanding that resistance was futile and cooperation was the only path to survival, would begin to crack. Every world that heard about humans choosing aliens over their own species would question whether the imperial truth was truly as absolute as its preachers claimed. The reports continued arriving, each one adding new complications to an already impossible situation. Compliance officers documented their attempts to separate human and Nephilim populations, hoping that isolation might break the bonds between the species. Instead, they found humans physically placing themselves between imperial forces and their alien neighbors, not as armed resistance but as living shields of moral witness. Children stood holding hands with Nephilim young. Elderly humans positioned themselves before alien community centers, and workers abandoned their posts to stand guard over Xenos residential districts. These were not the actions of people corrupted by alien parasites or deceived by Xenos manipulation. The assessment teams had been thorough in their examinations, and they found no evidence of psychic control, chemical dependency, or any other mechanism that might explain the population's behavior as anything other than genuine choice. The humans of the Nephilim worlds had simply decided, across multiple generations and countless individual relationships, that their Xenos neighbors were worth protecting. That decision, freely made by uncorrupted human minds, represented a threat to imperial ideology far greater than any military force could pose. Messages began arriving at Terra from expedition commanders requesting explicit guidance from the highest authorities. The standard protocols provided no clear path forward. These populations were human, unquestionably so, and the Imperium's entire purpose was supposedly the reunification and protection of humanity. But these same humans had made themselves inseparable from a Xenos species, binding their fate to creatures that Imperial doctrine declared must be eliminated without exception. The commanders needed to know which principle took precedence, and they needed that answer directly from those with the authority to make such determinations. The reports painted a picture that grew more troubling with each transmission. The Nephilim worlds were not isolated pockets of human-Xenos cooperation, but rather a functioning civilization that had solved problems the Imperium still struggled with. Their populations were healthy, educated, and productive. Their cities were clean and well-maintained. Their society showed none of the stratification and brutality that characterized so many human worlds, including those already brought into imperial compliance. The implication was clear and deeply uncomfortable. This alternative path, this cooperation with Xenos rather than their extermination, had produced results that compared favorably to the Imperium's own methods. That implication could not be allowed to stand. The reports reaching Terra demanded a response, and everyone who read them understood that only one authority in the entire Imperium possessed the standing to make the necessary decision. The matter would have to go before the Emperor himself. The reports from the Nephilim worlds created what some within the Imperial Palace would later describe as a profound stillness, a gathering weight that seemed to press down upon the golden halls of Terra with an almost physical presence. The Emperor had faced countless decisions during the Great Crusade, choices that determined the fate of billions, the destruction of entire species, the reshaping of human civilization itself. But the situation unfolding in those distant systems presented something fundamentally different, a challenge not to imperial military might, but to the philosophical foundations upon which the entire crusade had been built. What made the Nephilim situation so uniquely troubling was precisely what made it so dangerous. Had these Xenos been subtle manipulators controlling human populations through psychic domination, the response would have been straightforward. Had they been parasites feeding upon humanity while maintaining a facade of cooperation, the extermination order would have required no deliberation whatsoever. But every report, every assessment, every piece of evidence gathered by increasingly frustrated compliance officers pointed toward the same impossible conclusion. The Nephilim appeared to be exactly what they seemed, beings who had genuinely allied with humanity and maintained that alliance through thousands of years of darkness, without betrayal, without exploitation, without any of the predatory behaviors that defined virtually every other Xeno species humanity had encountered. The Emperor withdrew from public audiences for a period that various sources described differently, some suggesting days, others implying weeks. What occurred during this time remains the subject of intense speculation among those who study the hidden corners of imperial history. Some believe he consulted with the most trusted members of his inner circle, perhaps Malcador the Sigillite, whose counsel he valued above all others. Others suggest he spent this time in solitary contemplation, weighing the philosophical implications of what he was about to order against the practical necessities of the Imperium he was building. A few darker interpretations propose that he already knew exactly what must be done, and that this period of apparent deliberation was merely the Emperor steeling himself for an act he found personally distasteful but politically essential. The philosophical problem was devastatingly simple when stripped to its core. The entire justification for the Great Crusade's xenocidal policies rested upon a fundamental premise: that the galaxy's alien species were inherently hostile to humanity, that coexistence was impossible, that the only path to human survival lay through the absolute destruction of all non-human intelligent life. The Nephilim, by their very existence, by the thousands of years of peaceful cooperation they had maintained with human populations, represented living proof that this premise was not universally true. They demonstrated that alternatives existed, that the binary choice between dominance and extinction was a false dichotomy. If word of their existence spread throughout the young Imperium, how many would begin questioning whether the Crusade's methods were truly necessary? How many worlds might resist compliance not out of corruption or weakness, but out of genuine philosophical objection to xenocide as policy? The Emperor understood, perhaps better than any being alive, that empires are built upon stories as much as upon military force. The narrative he had constructed was elegant in its simplicity and powerful in its implications. Humanity had suffered during the Age of Strife because it had been preyed upon by Xenos species. The Imperium would ensure humanity's survival by eliminating all Xenos threats. This story united billions across thousands of worlds, gave purpose to the sacrifice of countless soldiers, and provided moral justification for acts that might otherwise be considered unconscionable. The Nephilim did not merely threaten this narrative. They annihilated it entirely. Their existence proved that not all aliens had preyed upon humanity during its weakness, that some had protected and aided human survival, that the suffering of the Age of Strife could not be laid solely at the feet of Xenos malevolence. There is a school of thought among those who study these events that suggests the Emperor faced a choice between two different versions of humanity's future. One path would acknowledge the complexity of interspecies relations, would build an imperium capable of distinguishing between genuine threats and potential allies, would create a more nuanced and ultimately more accurate understanding of the galaxy's dangers. This path would have required rewriting fundamental imperial doctrine, would have demanded that compliance officers develop entirely new protocols for evaluating Xenos encounters, would have opened the door to countless difficult questions about which species deserve destruction and which might deserve consideration. The other path was simpler, cleaner, and infinitely more brutal. Maintain the existing narrative at any cost, eliminate the evidence that contradicted it, and ensure that no one would ever have cause to question whether the Crusades' methods were truly necessary. The decision, when it finally came, arrived without fanfare or public announcement. No great proclamation echoed through the halls of the imperial palace. No philosophical justification was offered to explain the reasoning behind what was ordered. Instead, sealed communications departed Terra through the most secure astropathic channels available, carrying instructions that would only be opened by specific commanders whose loyalty had been verified through means that remain unclear. The content of these messages has never been officially confirmed, but the events that followed speak to their nature with terrible clarity. The Nephilim were to be destroyed, completely and utterly. The humans who defended them were to share their fate, and most crucially, most damningly, every record of their existence was to be erased so thoroughly that future generations would never know there had been anything to question in the first place. What makes this decision so haunting to contemplate is the cold calculation it reveals at the heart of imperial governance. The Emperor did not order the Nephilim destroyed because they represented a threat to humanity. He ordered them destroyed because they represented a threat to a story about threats to humanity. The distinction is subtle but profound, and it speaks to a willingness to sacrifice truth itself upon the altar of political necessity. Every xenocidal action that would follow throughout imperial history, every species exterminated without consideration of their actual threat level, every opportunity for cooperation rejected before it could be explored, all of it flows from this moment, from this choice, to preserve a useful lie rather than acknowledge a complicated truth. The orders that descended from Terra carried no ambiguity, no room for interpretation or local discretion. What followed was not a compliance action in any conventional sense, but rather the assembly of forces specifically chosen for their capacity to execute total erasure without hesitation or moral complication. The selection process itself revealed much about how the Imperium's military apparatus had evolved to handle situations that required absolute ruthlessness, drawing from units and commanders whose records demonstrated an unflinching willingness to carry out the most difficult directives without question. The expedition fleet that gathered at the muster point represented a concentration of destructive capability that seemed almost excessive for the task at hand. These were not fortress worlds bristling with defenses, nor were they populations armed with advanced weaponry that might threaten imperial forces. The Nephilim worlds were peaceful, their inhabitants unprepared for the violence that was about to descend upon them. Yet the fleet assembled as though preparing to crack open a heavily fortified sector. Warships of every classification arranged in formations designed to ensure no vessel could escape the system once operations commenced. The message was clear to anyone who understood void warfare. This was not a campaign that would permit survivors or refugees. Every approach vector would be covered, every potential escape route blocked by weapons platforms capable of reducing fleeing ships to expanding clouds of debris. The ground forces selected for deployment came primarily from Imperial Army regiments, whose histories contained chapters that other units preferred not to discuss openly. These were formations that had earned their reputations in the darkest actions of the Crusade, compliance operations where the definition of victory required the complete absence of resistance because the complete absence of population had been achieved. Their commanders understood implicitly what was expected of them, and more importantly, they had demonstrated repeatedly that such understanding would translate into efficient action without the complications of conscience or hesitation. The soldiers themselves had been shaped by years of brutal campaigning into instruments capable of executing any order, their humanity worn smooth by the constant grinding pressure of total war. What made this deployment particularly chilling was the inclusion of specialist units whose very existence remained largely unknown to the broader Imperial military structure. These were the Emperor's hidden tools, formations that operated outside normal chains of command and answered to authorities that most officers would never encounter. Their presence indicated that this operation carried significance beyond mere military necessity, that it touched upon matters of such sensitivity that conventional forces alone could not be trusted with its complete execution. These specialists would handle the aspects of the campaign that required absolute discretion, the elimination of witnesses, the destruction of evidence, the careful erasure of anything that might allow future generations to piece together what had occurred in this forgotten corner of the galaxy. The Astartes contingent assigned to the operation arrived with the cold efficiency that characterized their kind, but even among the superhuman warriors of the legions, the units selected for this duty possessed particular qualities. They came from companies within their respective legions known for their willingness to engage in actions that other Astartes might find distasteful, warriors whose psychological conditioning had produced minds capable of viewing any target as simply that, a target to be eliminated regardless of whether it fought back or pleaded for mercy. Their deployment protocols had been modified for this specific operation, emphasizing speed and totality over the preservation of infrastructure or resources that might normally be considered valuable to the expanding Imperium. The fleet's departure from the muster point occurred without ceremony or fanfare, a stark contrast to the triumphal send-offs that typically accompanied great crusade expeditions. No iterators delivered rousing speeches about the glory of reunification. No remembrancers documented the assembled might of humanity setting forth to reclaim its birthright. Instead, the ships translated into the warp with the quiet efficiency of executioners approaching their work, their crews already preparing for operations that would never appear in official histories. The journey itself was conducted under communications protocols that isolated the fleet from normal Imperial astropathic networks, ensuring that no inadvertent messages would leak information about their destination or purpose. As the fleet emerged from the warp at the edge of the first Nephilim system, the commanders distributed final operational briefings that left no room for misunderstanding. Every settlement would be targeted, every population center reduced to ash, every individual, whether human or Nephilim, treated as a hostile combatant regardless of their actual actions. The campaign would proceed systematically, world by world, until nothing remained but sterilized planets and the silence of extinction. The destruction began not with the population centers, but with the places where the Nephilim had stored their accumulated wisdom across countless generations. Imperial forces had learned from previous extermination campaigns that a species could survive the death of its people if its knowledge persisted, that ideas carried a terrible resilience that outlasted flesh and bone. The Nephilim had built vast repositories of crystalline structures that contained their histories, their philosophies, their understanding of the cosmos developed across ages that predated humanity's first tentative steps beyond the cradle world. These archives became the first targets subjected to sustained bombardment that reduced them to slag and scattered fragments before ground forces even made planetfall. What the initial strikes could not reach, specialized teams were deployed to locate and eliminate. The Nephilim had integrated their knowledge systems into the very architecture of their civilization, weaving historical records and cultural touchstones into structures that served dual purposes as both functional spaces and living memories. Teams equipped with archaeotech scanners moved through cities that were still burning, identifying nodes of information storage and marking them for demolition. They worked with methodical precision, understanding that their mission required not merely the death of beings, but the absolute annihilation of everything those beings had created and believed. The cultural destruction extended to artifacts that seemed innocuous to human eyes, but carried profound significance within Nephilim society. Musical instruments that produced harmonics beyond human hearing were collected and melted down in mobile furnaces. Artworks that depicted the Nephilim understanding of existence, their creation myths, their interpretations of the universe's fundamental nature, were gathered into piles and burned while scribes documented each piece before its destruction, creating records that would themselves be purged once the operation concluded. The irony was not lost on some participants, this meticulous cataloging of items destined for oblivion. But the imperial apparatus demanded thorough accounting even of things it intended to erase completely. Gardens that the Nephilim had cultivated across millennia were poisoned and burned. These were not merely aesthetic spaces, but repositories of biological knowledge, containing plant species the Nephilim had modified and perfected across countless generations, specimens that represented their understanding of life itself. Imperial forces deployed chemical agents that sterilized the soil to depths that would prevent regrowth for centuries, ensuring that even the genetic legacy encoded in these cultivated organisms would not survive the purge. The destruction teams reported soil that screamed as it died, though whether this was literal or metaphorical remained unclear in the heavily redacted after-action reports. The architectural achievements of the Nephilim civilization presented particular challenges for the destruction protocols. Their cities had been designed with an organic flowing quality that made them difficult to demolish using standard imperial methods. Structures curved and interconnected in ways that distributed force rather than concentrating it, requiring specialized approaches to bring them down completely. Engineering teams worked alongside the destruction forces, analyzing each major structure to determine the most efficient method of total collapse. What had taken the Nephilim generations to build was reduced to rubble in days, but even this pace was considered too slow by the commanders overseeing the operation. The systematic nature of the cultural destruction revealed a terrible thoroughness in imperial methodology. Teams were assigned specific categories of Nephilim achievement to eliminate, with progress tracked against quotas and timelines established by planners who had never set foot on these worlds. Religious sites, educational facilities, medical centers that represented the culmination of Nephilim healing knowledge, governmental structures where their civilization had organized itself, all were cataloged, targeted, and destroyed according to schedules that treated genocide as a logistical exercise requiring proper management. Human observers who witnessed this destruction, those few who were not themselves marked for elimination, described a sense of watching something irreplaceable being erased from existence. The Nephilim had achieved things that humanity had not, had developed understanding in areas where human knowledge remained primitive, and all of it was being methodically reduced to ash and memory. Some of those observers understood that they too would not survive to carry those memories forward, that the thoroughness of the destruction extended to anyone who might someday speak of what had been lost. The final phase of cultural destruction targeted the shared spaces where Nephilim and humans had built something together. These hybrid structures represented the most dangerous evidence of all, physical proof that cooperation between species was not merely possible, but could produce results that neither could achieve alone. These sites received particular attention, demolished with an intensity that suggested fear as much as policy, as though the very stones might somehow testify to possibilities that the Imperium could not afford to acknowledge. The extermination of the Nephilim themselves represented only half of the task that Imperial forces had been assigned, and in many ways it was the simpler half. Xenos were Xenos. Their destruction could be framed within the established doctrines that had guided countless purges across the expanding Imperium. But the humans who stood beside them, who refused evacuation orders and compliance demands, who took up arms alongside beings they had known for generations as neighbors, friends, and family in all but blood, these presented a far more troubling problem that cut to the heart of everything the Great Crusade claimed to represent. The first executions occurred in the chaos of active resistance, moments when Imperial forces could frame the killings as combat casualties rather than what they truly were. Human defenders died alongside Nephilim in the streets of burning cities, their bodies intermingled in death as their lives had been intermingled in peace. Some accounts suggest that Imperial commanders initially hoped the violence of the initial assault would solve the problem naturally, that enough human defenders would fall in battle to avoid the necessity of more systematic measures. But the scale of human resistance far exceeded any projections, and it became clear that active combat alone would not eliminate the problem they represented. What followed was something that participating forces would carry with them for the remainder of their service, a weight that no amount of conditioning or doctrinal reinforcement could fully suppress. Humans who had surrendered, who had laid down weapons after the Nephilim they defended had already fallen, were separated from the general population and processed through hastily established detention facilities. The official designation for these individuals varied depending on which force was handling them. Some records refer to them as Xenos corrupted elements, others as irrecoverable collaborators, and still others simply as Category 7 subjects requiring final processing. The euphemisms served a purpose. They created linguistic distance between the executioners and the nature of their task. The numbers involved staggered even veterans of the most brutal compliance actions the Great Crusade had undertaken. Entire communities had chosen to stand with the Nephilim rather than accept Imperial authority, and the execution orders made no distinction based on age, status, or the degree of individual involvement. A farmer who had simply refused to evacuate his land because his Nephilim neighbors had taught him agricultural techniques that had sustained his family for 3 generations received the same fate as armed resistance fighters who had died defending crystalline archives. Children who had grown up playing with Nephilim young, who had never known a world where such friendship was considered aberrant, were processed alongside their parents. The logic was brutally consistent. Anyone who had experienced this integration, who had lived proof that humans and Xenos could coexist in genuine partnership, represented a contamination that could not be permitted to survive and spread. Some Imperial forces assigned to execution duties requested transfer or developed sudden incapacitating conditions that required their removal from active service. The rate of such requests exceeded anything recorded in previous campaigns, creating administrative complications that frustrated commanders trying to maintain operational efficiency. Replacements had to be drawn from units with less exposure to the populations being processed, soldiers who could look at the humans awaiting execution and see only traitors to their species, rather than people who had simply lived differently than Imperial doctrine permitted. The psychological toll this took on executing forces would never be officially acknowledged, but the unusually high rate of later disciplinary problems, mental deterioration, and unexplained deaths among veterans of this campaign suggests that even the most hardened soldiers found something uniquely corrosive about this particular duty. The methods employed varied based on the scale of populations being processed and the resources available to local commanders. Mass executions by bolter fire left too much evidence and consumed ammunition needed for ongoing operations, so alternative approaches were developed with grim efficiency. Some populations were herded into structures that were then sealed and subjected to atmospheric purging, their deaths recorded only as casualty figures in reports that would themselves later be destroyed. Others were loaded onto transport vessels that never reached any recorded destination, their passengers simply vanishing from existence as completely as if they had never lived. The creativity applied to solving the logistical problems of mass human execution represented a dark innovation that would unfortunately find application in later Imperial operations, though its origins in this campaign would be deliberately obscured. What struck some observers as particularly haunting was the dignity many human defenders maintained even facing certain death. They did not beg for mercy or renounce their connections to the Nephilim, instead meeting their executions with a quiet resolve that seemed to genuinely disturb their killers. Some spoke final words about the friends they had lost, about the world they had known, about their hope that someday humanity would remember what had been possible here. These words were not recorded in any official capacity, but they lingered in the memories of those who heard them, fragments of testimony that would occasionally surface in deathbed confessions or encrypted personal journals discovered centuries later. The humans who died defending the Nephilim seemed to understand that they were being erased, not because they had failed, but because they had succeeded in demonstrating something the Imperium could not permit to exist. The killing had been terrible, but what came after required a different kind of precision, a methodical thoroughness that transformed soldiers into archivists of annihilation. Even as the last defenders fell and the final Nephilim settlements burned, specialized teams were already at work on a task that would ultimately prove more challenging than the extermination itself. The Imperium had destroyed countless species, but rarely had it faced the need to erase not just a civilization, but the very memory that such a civilization had ever achieved something the Imperial truth declared impossible. The scale of documentation that existed across the Nephilim worlds staggered even those who had been briefed on the integration's depth. Every library contained records of cooperation stretching back thousands of years. Administrative archives held treaties, trade agreements, and joint governance documents that demonstrated how two species had learned to build something together. Medical facilities maintained research conducted by human and Nephilim scientists working side by side, breakthroughs in healing and biology that neither species could have achieved alone. Educational institutions preserved curricula that taught children of both kinds to see each other as partners in a shared civilization. The sheer volume of evidence was overwhelming, and every piece of it contradicted everything the Imperium claimed about the nature of Xenos. The purge teams operated with systematic efficiency, moving through each world in carefully planned sweeps designed to ensure nothing escaped their attention. They had been equipped with specialized scanning equipment capable of detecting hidden storage facilities, underground vaults where communities might have attempted to preserve their most precious records. Every structure was searched, every data repository accessed and wiped, every physical document collected for destruction. The teams had been instructed to assume that inhabitants would have anticipated this possibility and hidden materials accordingly, which meant treating every building, every home, every seemingly innocuous location as a potential archive. What they discovered confirmed these suspicions repeatedly. Families had buried crystal memory cores in their gardens, hoping future generations might one day unearth evidence of what had been lost. Community leaders had sealed historical records within the walls of buildings, protected by materials designed to survive fire and demolition. Some had even attempted to scatter documentation across wilderness areas, hiding pieces of their shared history in caves, beneath ancient trees, in locations that held meaning only to those who had lived within this civilization. The purge teams found nearly all of it, their equipment and methodologies having been refined across centuries of similar operations. The destruction of physical records proved almost straightforward compared to the challenge of erasing digital and crystalline storage systems. The Nephilim had developed data preservation technologies that exceeded anything the Imperium commonly encountered. matrices capable of storing vast quantities of information in forms that resisted conventional deletion methods. Imperial tech priests worked alongside the purge teams, applying techniques that bordered on techno-sorcery to ensure complete erasure. Some storage systems required physical destruction at the molecular level, their contents so deeply encoded that nothing less than total annihilation would suffice. Beyond the Nephilim worlds themselves, the purge extended to every point of contact between this civilization and the broader galaxy. Trade routes had connected these systems to neighboring human colonies, and each of those colonies had maintained records of their interactions. Merchant vessels that had carried goods between worlds possessed logs documenting their journeys. Astropathic relay stations had transmitted messages that referenced the Nephilim by name. The web of documentation extended far beyond the immediate theater of extermination, requiring coordinated operations across dozens of systems to ensure complete erasure. The Imperial forces themselves presented another challenge entirely. Thousands of soldiers, crew members, and support personnel had witnessed the Nephilim civilization firsthand. They had walked through cities where humans and Xenos lived as neighbors, had seen the evidence of successful integration with their own eyes. Many had participated in the execution of human defenders, had heard their final words declaring love and loyalty for their alien companions. These witnesses carried memories that could not be erased through conventional means, and the documentation of their experiences posed its own category of risk. Official records of the campaign underwent careful revision before transmission back to Terra. Compliance reports were rewritten to describe a standard Xenos purge, the liberation of human populations from alien domination. Casualty figures were adjusted to eliminate any reference to human defenders, their deaths attributed to Xenos aggression or the unfortunate necessities of combat operations. The Nephilim themselves were reduced to a few sparse lines, describing a minor hostile species eliminated during routine expansion, their civilization compressed into bureaucratic language that conveyed nothing of what had actually existed. The astropathic archives on Terra received particular attention, teams of specially cleared personnel reviewing every message that had originated from or referenced the affected systems. Transmissions that contained detailed descriptions of integration were deleted entirely. Those that mentioned the Nephilim in passing were edited to remove specific references, their contents altered to describe generic Xenos threats rather than the unique civilization that had prompted such unprecedented orders. The archivists worked with the knowledge that their own memories would eventually require similar treatment, that they too would become loose ends requiring resolution. Historical databases throughout the Imperium were systematically audited for any reference to the Nephilim or their worlds. The species had apparently made contact with human explorers during the Age of Strife, and fragments of those early encounters had survived in scattered archives across multiple sectors. Each fragment was located and destroyed, the records amended to show nothing but empty space where thriving worlds had once existed. Star charts were altered to remove the systems entirely, their coordinates reassigned or simply deleted from navigational databases. The thoroughness of this erasure revealed something profound about Imperial methodology, a recognition that ideas possessed a dangerous persistence that outlasted their physical manifestations. A single surviving document could plant seeds of doubt, could suggest that the absolute xenophobia demanded by Imperial doctrine was not the only possible relationship between humanity and alien species. The Nephilim had proven that coexistence was achievable, and that proof had to be eliminated completely, not merely suppressed, but genuinely erased from the possibility of future discovery. The physical records had been reduced to ash, and the crystalline libraries melted into formless slag. But the most dangerous repositories of the Nephilim's existence remained untouched by flame or meltabeam. Human memory, that stubborn and resilient thing that had carried stories across generations, even through the darkest years of Old Night, represented a threat that no amount of physical destruction could fully address. The soldiers who had carried out the extermination, the naval personnel who had transported them, the administratum officials who had processed the original reports, the astropaths who had transmitted messages between the campaign and Terra, every single individual who possessed even fragmentary knowledge of what had transpired on those worlds became a potential vector through which the truth might escape into the wider Imperium. The protocols that activated in the campaign's aftermath demonstrated a level of institutional paranoia that even veteran officers found chilling in its thoroughness. Entire regiments that had participated in the ground operations received orders for immediate redeployment to distant war zones, their transport ships following routes that would keep them isolated from any contact with other Imperial forces for months or years. These assignments were not random. They had been specifically selected for their lethality, campaigns against Orc strongholds or chaos-tainted worlds where casualty rates routinely exceeded 90%. The men and women who had witnessed the Nephilim's final days were being fed into meat grinders across the galaxy, their deaths rendered unremarkable amid the constant slaughter of the Great Crusade's expansion. Those whose positions made such convenient disposal impractical required more direct attention. Senior officers who had commanded the extermination forces found themselves summoned to private audiences where they received very specific instructions about the nature of their continued service to the Imperium. Some accepted the implicit bargain, understanding that their silence purchased not only their own survival, but the safety of their families and bloodlines. These individuals would carry the weight of what they knew for the remainder of their lives, growing old with secrets that they could never share, watching their subordinates die in distant campaigns and understanding exactly why those deaths had been arranged. Others proved less amenable to such arrangements, their consciences or their pride making them unreliable vessels for eternal silence. These officers suffered accidents with disturbing regularity, training mishaps and equipment failures, and sudden illnesses that claimed them before they could become problems. Their deaths were investigated with appropriate solemnity and attributed to the ordinary hazards of military service, their names added to honor rolls, and their families compensated according to standard protocols. No pattern emerged because no pattern was allowed to emerge, each death separated from the others by distance and time and circumstance, the connecting thread visible only to those who had woven it. The astropaths presented a unique challenge that required specialized solutions. These psychers had transmitted the original reports from the Nephilim worlds, had felt the emotional content of those messages passing through their minds, had touched, however briefly, the strange peace that had existed between human and Xenos. Their memories could not be trusted to remain buried, not when their psychic abilities might cause fragments of knowledge to surface during later transmissions or bleed into the minds of other astropaths during choir communications. The solution implemented was elegant in its brutality. The affected astropaths were simply burned out, their powers pushed beyond sustainable limits during a series of emergency transmissions that left them dead or mindless husks, requiring termination. The administratum scribes and remembrancers who had processed documentation related to the campaign faced their own reckoning. Most were simply reassigned to positions where their knowledge would become irrelevant, buried in bureaucratic roles so far removed from anything connected to the Nephilim that their memories would naturally fade into the background noise of endless paperwork. Those who had shown particular aptitude for retaining information, whose minds were too sharp and too curious to be trusted with gradual forgetting, received transfers to archives on worlds that would subsequently suffer convenient catastrophes, their deaths attributed to orc raids or warp storms or industrial accidents that consumed all evidence of their existence. The families of those executed alongside the Nephilim required perhaps the most delicate handling of all. These bloodlines had roots extending back into the broader human population, relatives on other worlds who might eventually ask questions about cousins and siblings who had simply vanished. The solution involved a careful rewriting of personal histories, records altered to show that these individuals had died during the Age of Strife or had never existed at all, their names erased from genealogical databases and their images removed from family archives. When relatives inquired, they found only confusion and contradictory documentation, their memories of loved ones gradually undermined by official records that insisted those people had never been real. Perhaps most disturbing were the measures taken against those who had never directly witnessed the campaign, but who had stumbled upon fragments of knowledge through accident or investigation. Scholars researching the Age of Strife who asked too many questions about certain stellar coordinates, merchants who had once traded with the Nephilim worlds before the Crusades' arrival, even individuals who had simply heard rumors and repeated them too loudly, all found themselves subject to attention from agencies whose existence was never officially acknowledged. Some disappeared entirely, others suffered convenient misfortunes. Still others simply stopped asking questions after visits from officials who explained very clearly what happened to those who pursued certain lines of inquiry. The enforcement apparatus that maintained this silence grew into something permanent, an institutional commitment that would outlast the individuals who had created it. Protocols were established for monitoring any references to the Nephilim across Imperial communications, automated systems designed to flag certain terminology and alert appropriate authorities to potential security breaches. These systems would continue operating for millennia, maintained by personnel who had no idea what specific secret they were protecting, only that their vigilance served the Emperor's will and that failure would result in consequences they preferred not to contemplate. The Nephilim vanished from history so completely that within a few generations, even the rumors of their existence had faded into the background noise of a galaxy filled with horrors and wonders beyond counting. The worlds they had shared with humanity were resettled, their names changed, their populations replaced with colonists who knew nothing of what had come before. The integration that had seemed so remarkable, so unprecedented in its depth and success, became less than a footnote in the annals of imperial expansion. It became nothing at all, a void where memory should have been, an absence that no one thought to question because no one remembered there was anything to question. But the implications of what had been erased extended far beyond the simple loss of historical knowledge. The destruction of the Nephilim represented something more than the elimination of a single Xenos species. It was the deliberate annihilation of proof that the fundamental assumptions underlying imperial doctrine might be flawed. Every sermon preached about the inherent treachery of alien minds. Every educational text explaining why humanity must stand alone against the hostile universe, every piece of propaganda depicting Xenos as inevitably predatory and malevolent, all of it rested upon a foundation that the Nephilim had threatened to crack. Their existence had demonstrated that cooperation was possible, that trust could be built across the divide of species, that the isolation the Imperium demanded was a choice rather than a necessity. By erasing them, the Emperor had not simply eliminated a potential complication. He had removed the evidence that might have inspired future generations to question whether the path of total xenocide was truly the only way forward. The soldiers who had carried out the extermination and survived the subsequent silencing carried their own burdens into the campaigns that followed. Some of them became the most zealous advocates for Xenos destruction, their fervor fed by a need to justify what they had participated in, to believe that the peaceful coexistence they had shattered had been somehow false or corrupted in ways they simply had not perceived. Others withdrew into a kind of hollowed efficiency, executing their duties with mechanical precision, while something essential within them remained forever dimmed. A few, those who could not reconcile what they had witnessed with what they had been told about the nature of all alien life, eventually broke in ways that their commanders attributed to the general stresses of crusade warfare. No one connected these casualties to a specific campaign that officially had never occurred. The Primarchs who had been involved in the decision or its execution processed the event according to their own natures. But even among these demigods, the Nephilim left marks that would influence their later actions in ways they themselves might not have fully understood. For those who had harbored doubts about the absolute necessity of xenocide, the affair served as a brutal lesson in the limits of dissent within the imperial hierarchy. The Emperor's willingness to exterminate not only aliens but the humans who loved them demonstrated that certain boundaries could not be crossed, certain questions could not be asked, certain alternatives could not be explored. This knowledge shaped how they approached subsequent encounters with Xenos species, how they weighed the potential for cooperation against the certainty of imperial doctrine. Some became more rigid in their adherence to established protocols, unwilling to risk the consequences of deviation. Others harbored a quiet resentment that would later find expression in ways that shook the Imperium to its foundations. The philosophical implications ran even deeper than the political or military consequences. The Emperor had built his entire vision for humanity upon the premise that the species must unite under a single banner, free from the corrupting influences of religion, alien manipulation, and the chaos of competing ideologies. The Nephilim had presented a scenario that challenged this vision not through opposition but through success. By demonstrating that humans could thrive in partnership with non-human intelligences, they had suggested that the Emperor's model of isolated human supremacy was not the only viable path to species survival. This was perhaps the most dangerous aspect of their existence, more threatening than any military capability or territorial claim. They had offered an alternative future, a different answer to the question of what humanity could become, and for that heresy against the imperial vision, they had been condemned to oblivion. 10,000 years later, the Imperium that emerged from the Emperor's vision has become something he might scarcely recognize, a theocratic nightmare of superstition and stagnation that embodies many of the very things he sought to prevent. The xenophobic doctrine that the Nephilim's destruction helped establish has calcified into religious absolute, no longer a strategic choice but an article of faith that admits no questioning. Species that might once have been evaluated on their actual threat level are now exterminated on principle, their potential for cooperation never even considered. The galaxy has become a darker place for this rigid adherence to a doctrine that was itself built upon a deliberate lie, a suppression of evidence that other paths were possible. And somewhere in the depths of forgotten archives, in the corrupted data stacks of worlds that have changed hands a dozen times across the millennia, fragments persist. A partial text that mentions beings of light who taught humanity to sing. A damaged recording that shows figures of impossible grace moving alongside human children. A single word in an extinct dialect that translates roughly to "the friends who came from the stars." These remnants mean nothing to those who encounter them, scattered pieces of a puzzle that no one knows exists. But they remain, waiting perhaps for a day when someone might gather enough of them together to glimpse the shadow of what was lost, to understand that the Imperium's certainty about the nature of alien life was not discovered truth, but manufactured reality, built upon the ashes of a species whose only crime was proving that humanity did not have to be alone. If you found this journey through one of the Imperium's darkest buried secrets compelling, consider subscribing to the channel for more explorations of the hidden corners of the Warhammer 40,000 universe.